Hello, YouTube. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the minor controversy surrounding the Idris Frigate here in the last couple of days. And this controversy stems from really the expansion of the ship from the Idris Corvette as it was sold 3.5 years ago as part of the Kickstarter and early backer programs, to the fact that it grew into a frigate size object that is essentially 2.5 times the original size of the Corvette. And when it was originally proposed, it was proposed as a multi-crew ship, and it was certainly always going to take multiple crew members, especially if you wanted to launch fighters and stuff like that and have them flying those fighters for you. But I think it was centered around even where a smaller organization of, say, 10 to 20 members could have at least managed the ship. And I think they were aiming for a crew of somewhere being minimally viable, minimally effective at about 8, and around a dozen members, including fighter pilots, for having the ship at max combat capacity or max capabilities. Well, that number has essentially doubled. Most of them that I've seen thrown out there says that in order to crew a Idris Corvette satisfactorily from a human perspective, it's going to take about 25 players to do it, or at least 25 units mixed between players and NPCs, which wasn't necessarily too bad because there was a certain subset of players that were planning on crewing it with minimal human crew, and they're like, well, I'll just hire however many NPCs I need in order to man all of the stations and then fly it by myself. And they're kind of came back today and it's like, you may not be able to do that because there's certainly going to be a limit to how many AI you can have on board at any given time. What they don't want people to do is to go out and rent 10 AI pilots and put them in Hornets and escort them around everywhere. There has to be some sort of limits for gameplay balance reasons. Now, whether that limit's going to be different on the number of AI ships that you can hire to escort you versus how many AI you can hire to man crew stations on your ship, they haven't, it doesn't sound like they've really decided yet. That they themselves don't know. They're exploring it for possibilities further down the line. Additionally, if you bought extra game packages, like I think I have 3 or 4 game packages that my ships are a part of, and as a result, I should have my main character and then 3 AI slots. And then eventually someday you could basically buy additional character slots, put NPCs that would still be subject to the same permadeath mechanics and things like that that your main character are, but these are NPCs that you could essentially groom for certain tasks. If you assign them as gunners, they'll gain experience as being gunners and over time become better gunners. If you assign them to engineering, they'll eventually build up over time and become better engineers, sensor stations, medics, what have you, whatever other roles there may be in the game. And it doesn't sound like here necessarily that you're going to be able to, say, run out and buy 50 game packages or 25 game packages and then, oh, well, I could just use my 25. It sounds like there's going to be a limit there. And I think that that's what has some people who bought Idrises, especially for smaller organizations, that maybe it was, hey, me and just 3 of my 4 or 5 of my friends were planning on getting together on a Sunday afternoon and flying the ship around. Well, now we're not going to be able to do that because, well, unless I can bring my AI and my buddy Bob over here can bring his AI too, and then we could crew the ship. Maybe I'm controlling command and control, and then Bob's down in engineering with his AI, and then, our other friend Joe over here has his AI, and he's doing all the guns, and his AI are manning the turrets. Something like that, we don't know. Now, I think some of this problem will be resolved. Those very small organizations that bought this ship to be kind of their flagship, have a lot of fun with, I look for them to probably end up melting theirs and going with whatever the revised Corvette or the new Corvette that'll be proposed later on, because it sounds like that Corvette will probably go down and say, hey, you'll need about 10 people, give or take a couple, in order to crew the ship successfully. More than a Constellation, less than an Idris is probably where that sweetheart spot is going to be. So I look for that to happen. The other question is, the Idris frigate has kind of become the EP standard for organizations to measure themselves against others. Oh, our organization has 15 Idrises or 5 Idrises. And, with some organizations like, well, if you don't have an Idris, you're not a real organization, and all that crap that goes on with a game that still really has very little for organizations to do. At least with 2.2, we can somewhat party now on a semi-routine basis. It doesn't always seem to work with the instancing, but it seems to be working more often than not now. We were able to get into instances with each other on a much more predictable, I don't want to say scale, but more often than we were in previous iterations. We'll leave it at that over the weekend. And we were flying around, and this topic within our own organization, because we do have Idris Corvettes, United Logistics and Military, or ULMC. It's about 100 members, and it was always one of those things where, like, we can certainly crew an Idris, probably two, if given enough advanced warning. But are we going to really want to bring two Idrises to the fight where we could bring, a number of other ships, a couple of Retaliators and a couple of Constellations and a couple of Freelancers and a couple of Vanguard for what it would take to crew one Idris? Is it going to be that much of a force multiplier that is better to, say, bring that than opposed to 5 fully crewed Constellations with its snub fighters, or, 5 Constellations with gunners and snub fighter pilots, and then 5 Freelancers or 5 Vanguards or some other mix of ships that might be able to bring more firepower to bear overall into a target than just, say, one individual ship. I don't think that we have enough systems and stuff like that modeled into gameplay yet to really adequately predict it, but with 2.2, something that we've noticed thus far is it seemed to be far better to have more ships flying, even if they are understaffed. Having 5, say, Constellations was better than having, say, 1 Constellation that was fully manned. Now, granted, right now, engineering is very rudimentary functionality there. There's no sensor functionality. The gunners are there. I'm not sure how valuable gunners really are at this point. Would I much rather have a gunner, or would I much rather have somebody else flying in a Hornet or a Saber on my wing, or a Vanguard for that matter? And I think my answer would have to be I'd much rather have somebody flying on my wing as opposed to being my gunner. That certainly seems to be more effective in most scenarios. The exception having to be anything that involves EVA. In those situations, having an extra crew member or two in a multi-crew ship means they can go and do the EVA portion, whether it's the Kovalek shipping hub or repairing a comm array, while you continue to fly outside, essentially top cover or a TAR cap, essentially, or target combat air patrol. And then, they go do the mission, and they come back out and get picked up, where if you try to do that with, let's say, a 300 or an Aurora or a Hornet or something like that, a single-seat fighter, and if you leave that single-seat fighter, there's a very good chance that somebody's going to come around and blow up that ship while you're inside, or come and try and steal it with one of their friends. Maybe they're flying a Cutlass and they've got 2 of them on board, and one of them EVAs out and hijacks your ship and takes off with it, and then you're essentially stranded and have to commit suicide. At this point, it's alpha. It doesn't really matter. Nobody's keeping score. At least if you are keeping score at this point, you're doing it wrong. As far as I'm concerned, it's no harm, no foul. There's no real penalty for losing your stuff, as it were. Now is the time to be playing on some of the stuff and trying, as I tell members of my own organization, hey, if you've got a better idea of a suggestion on how we should go and approach something, now's the time to propose it and test it out. No idea is too wild or crazy. You're not going to hear me say, that'll never work. You're going to hear me say, okay, let's try that and see what happens, because that's the stage of the game that we're in right now. And hey, it's better to try it now and say, haha, that didn't work, than it would be later on, where there might be items, in-game items, cash shop items, whatever they may end up being, on the line, and characters that maybe you've grown attached to, and their abilities and reputation you've built up being on the line, as it were. So, it's much better to test that stuff now when it doesn't really count for anything. It's under the purview of testing. So, at any rate, that's kind of a couple of my thoughts on what was going on with the Idris Frigate. You may agree, you may not agree. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and I will see you next time.